Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those listening, we hope you're all well and safe, inshallah, and that your studies are going well. This is our second talk on our Islamophobia campaign at Sussex ISOC, and today I am joined by Ijlal and Ayo. So, Ijlal, you may have seen from the talk last week, he is the Vice President of Higher Education at FOSIS, the Federation of Student Islamic Societies. And today I am also joined by Ayo Olatunji. He is a clinical medical student at UCL. He joined FOSIS in May 2019, and he is the current Vice President of Student Affairs, which essentially means that he overlooks the political issues which pertain to Muslim students. So with today's talk, it will be on deconstructing Islamophobia, looking at its definition and why that's important for us as Muslims, its socio-political context, and how Islamophobia is presented in the how it's manifested in the present day. So I'll hand it over to Ayo. And the first question I've got really is what importance does a definition hold? Because to some, it may just be like, oh, if you open a dictionary, like this word means that, this word means that. Why is it important for us as Muslims to have a set definition of Islamophobia?
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to everybody who's listening. Jazakallah khair for inviting me on to speak. So just to begin with your question, um, when we look at definitions of types of oppressions or definitions of things that communities face within the British context or the Western spheres, the way these definitions are typically used is within a court of law, within institutions such as government institutions, in parliament, law enforcement, all these kind of spheres. It could be educational institutions, universities, schools, could be think tanks, trade unions. So very loads of institutions are where these kind of definitions can be enshrined in. And even if it's not enshrined in the constitution or the bylaws or the strategy of an organization or an institution, it can still have a societal effect. So to some, they may say a definition doesn't have it doesn't have a huge effect, but it really can do depending on how it's used and who is using it. So that's my answer to that. And I think, me personally, I think that defining the oppression that, for example, the Muslim community is going through, I think it's something that needs to be done with careful consideration. Yes, we take into account the societal issues that are going on now and affecting Muslims, but it's very crucial that within such definitions and when defining our oppression and defining what our community goes through, we take into account our tradition, our faith, and our values. If we do not do that, we risk creating a secular narrative and a narrative which discounts faith and you know um, uh, puts forward and considers primarily other aspects of what society would deem important. So, for example, race, ethnicity, what nationality, all these kind of things, and these things start to precede faith. And again, when these kind of narratives are cemented throughout society, throughout these institutions, these are the kind of things that will then be projected back onto our community. So then the expectation of our community is then that we must become secularized and our faith must become secularized. So definitions actually can be very, very powerful. Um, there are certain definitions which people use in whether it be academic papers or they use it in conversation, and they won't even realize that they're using these definitions. They won't even realize how it shaped the conversations and discourse that they're having. But just because you didn't realize it doesn't mean you're not playing a part in it. Doesn't mean you're not being influenced by it. So that'd be in short, my answer to that. Sure.
It's a pretty good point IU has raised, and I think it's important to understand that, like, a lot of these definitions, they haven't just emerged as a result of people, that their thinking is flawed. A lot of times, it's a very concerted effort to impose these definitions on our communities as well. There's a very concerted effort to secularize our community. It's not that this is happening just because someone is misunderstanding how they understand, the Muslim community, or they misunderstand the deen of Islam, or how Muslims experience their lived realities with regards to their faith. This is a very strategic and concerted effort that is being led by think tanks and people who are getting funding as well in a lot of cases from government bodies and bodies that don't want Muslims to have a faith-based Islamic reality. It is in their interests to strip Muslims and the Muslim community of their faith, of their religion, of their commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's a very strategic effort to serve the community. And I think it's important for us to realize, as Muslims within this community, it's important to realize that this is happening right in front of us and we're allowing it to happen. And to challenge it, we need to recognize it. We need to understand that a lot of these people who are doing this, a lot of these organizations, institutions, and structures that are proposing this, and the ones who need to gain from this, it's important to identify them. It's important to sort of then put barriers to say that, no, you know what? We're not going to become subservient to this narrative, become subservient to this discourse, and just go with the flow in the interests of strategic values and politics and greater long-term interests. We have to stay true to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and stay true to our faith, and stay true to what Islam it brings for us, the aqidah that we have, and our commitment to the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's really important that we sort of connect all of this with this strategic thing that is happening as well, to connect it with this wider discourse.
I didn't realize the extent to which just how powerful a definition could be, because because it isn't just a case of a set of words, like a set of arbitrary words, which you just read and you think, oh, that's it. Actually, it's a very powerful tool, and as you said, I didn't realize the extent to which institutions, for example, are able to use these terms and definitions to control the narrative and sort of frame it in a way that, as I said, like secularize the Muslim community.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and just if I can add on more to that, we need to look at the methodology that has been taken to arrive at this definition. With generally the way things work is when a community wants to define its own oppression, there are intra-community discussions and dialogues that happen. So the community within itself hashes out what are the most important things. What should we consider? What should we, what are our primary concerns? How should we phrase these things? But with our community, this isn't what we did. We went to outside organizations. I'm not fully sure of all the discussions that happened, but what we can know is that the launch, I guess, of Islamophobia as a concept, as a word, and definitions around it, was launched by. It wasn't launched primarily by Muslim organizations and the Muslim community. So this is the first issue. We started off defining our oppression with consultation from everybody, right? And this trend is still happening till today, to the point where we see, for example, the All Parliamentary Party Group definition on Islamophobia. That is the definition that's being pushed the most right now. And we see groups, not only that, it's not just that they're not Muslim, they are groups who have either insinuated or outwardly, said and professed that Muslims are backwards or Islam is backwards and it needs reforming, or violent or hateful. Why are we consulting groups like that in what our narrative consists of? And why are we consulting people who are not within the community on what our narrative consists of, when we haven't even got consensus amongst ourselves? And if people feel a certain way about Islam, or they are hostile towards it, they are obviously going to bring in their own agendas into how this definition looks like and what it's comprised of. And again, this is a narrative that I have spoken to different people about, whether it be community leaders or people on the ground, and it's something that really needs to be taken seriously, um, because we need to have a consensus within ourselves. We can't go and consult everybody outside. Other groups, the way they've gone about it is they've got consensus amongst themselves, at least a broad consensus on fundamental things, and then they go out to other groups and then they push and they lobby. However, we did the consultation outside of our community mainly, and now we're pushing and lobbying. I think, to be honest with you, as Ijlal said before, what we are seeing is that, you know, that some of these narratives are being pushed onto our community. And if you do come up against it, you know, it's said that, you know, perhaps you either don't care about Islamophobia, or, you know, you don't want to see action happening, or you don't want to see change, or this is our only chance, we need to seize this chance. But, you know, we need to be more focused on the long term. We can't be focused on the short term gains that we think we're going to get, because there are communities, faith communities, who, you know, an important one is when Jewish community, for example, is an ethno-religious community, right? And when this categorization of are they a race, are they, you know, what are they? This kind of discourse was coming about. You saw, and I think it was the 1930s to 1940s, prominent Jewish activists came out and said, no, Judaism is not a race. It is a, you know, it's a faith, and it's comprised of people from many races, right? And now, when you fast forward, you see people saying they're secular Jews or they're from Jewish heritage, right? And I think it's very important to put it forward that, you know, as Muslims, I don't think we want to get to the point where people are saying they're of Muslim heritage or they're a secular Muslim, because this shows that our values have been sidelined, and Islam is only something you are in name but not in practice. And that's something I think is very, very important for us as a community to preserve. So these are just some of the issues that I have with the definition. We don't want to secularize. We don't want to. And there's this discourse of Islamophobia as a type of racism, right? And then a lot of right wing people, you know, far right, you know, groups say, "Oh, Islam isn't a race," and you get even, you know, some Muslim activists and academics who come and say, "Yes, we know Islam isn't a race, but Islamophobia is a type of racism," and they sort of berate them for bringing that criticism. But you know, it's a criticism which carries weight, and as long as we have this thing of Islamophobia is a type of racism, we're gonna keep getting Islam is a race. But Islam is made, you know, it's a religion, which is it's a religion. It's a, you know, Muslims are a faith group or not a race, right? And when we primarily frame our oppression from the paradigm of it's a type of racism, again, this is dangerous because it starts to homogenize our community. We have Black Muslims, we have white Muslims, we have South Asian Muslims, Southeast Asian, we've got Arab, we've got Muslims from everywhere, alhamdulillah. But, you know, when we start to say that, you know, Muslims are a race, or Islamophobia is a type of racism, what it does is it creates an image of what a Muslim is, right? And that image tends to be brown-skinned South Asian male who wears a beard, or a brown-skinned South Asian female who wears the hijab, and aspects of our religiosity. So, for example, the beard, the hijab, all these kind of things become racial markers now. They're no longer religious markers. And you'll see academics writing this, you know. You'll see, you know, things being said that religious practice has nothing to do with it. It's about the racism. It's about the systems and the structures, right? But so where's faith in this? Where is the discussion of faith? This is really, really important. I have more things to say, but I'll let Ijlal come in as well, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair, I think some really key points. And you know what, like, it's really pertinent that you mentioned that our paradigm for going about this is wrong, because subhanallah, you know what my issue is with Muslim activists, primarily, not even people outside the Muslim community, Muslim academics and Muslim activists and people on the ground, community organizations who have the ability. They just need to own their ability better. They need to own their responsibility better, instead of not using the same frameworks that are available to them for other discourses, but in fact originating a framework that is rooted within Quran and Sunnah for ourselves. And that's, I think, where my problem starts, because a lot of times we have this tendency, a lot of times as Muslims, you know, like we like to jump on the bandwagon. If there's something going on, you'd see, you know, like if there's anti-racist struggles going on, where we want to be involved in them, which is good. You know, we should be involved in anti-racist struggles, but we should, when we're talking about Islamophobia, when we're talking about something which is very specific to our deen and the experience of our deen and being a person who is a believer, then we should be originating a framework that is very much rooted within that deen, very much rooted within that Quran and Sunnah framework that we have. It shouldn't be something that is available to us from another framework we try to come to terms with from an Islamic standpoint. Or, you know, we are going to do anti-racism, or we're going to do, you know, social justice activism or whatever, but we're going to approach it from those frameworks, and we're going to try and find linkages between that and the framework that Islam gives us, and then we're going to say that's the frame. And then what you're doing is you're not using your own framework. You're just using that framework, and you're just using things that give you some linkages, but not something that is very much rooted and based and originated from a Quran and Sunnah framework. And that's where I think a lot of times we, within this Islamophobia definition construction, we as a community have gone wrong, academics have gone wrong, Muslims to a large extent have gone wrong in the discourse, because they haven't really taken ownership of or even understood, or, you know, we haven't had we haven't really studied how we should approach it from a Quran and Sunnah framework. We have just gone, we've seen, like, you know, there is racism is an accepted oppression in society, so we just take it from that and we apply it to Islam, because that oppression, that discourse is getting momentum. So just to feed off of that same momentum, to use that as a means to springboard our oppression on, just use that framework for sort of conceptualizing our oppression, which is completely wrong. You know, like this, in my opinion, it shows our lack of knowledge, it shows our lack of courage and our lack of trust in our own Quran and Sunnah framework, you know. And it sort of, you know, it shows to us the sad reality of the Ummah as well sometimes, that we haven't done the tarbiyah within ourselves, we haven't learned Islam for ourselves, yet we are basing our interpretation of Islam and our oppression on things that other non-Muslim discourses and non-Muslim social justice activists and non-Muslim academics are teaching us. And I think it's another point for us to take stock of ourselves as well. That how long do we let ourselves and let them continue on doing this? You know, we'll come to a point where, as Ayo was saying at the start, like, secularize more and more. And this is again a means to do that. This is again something that would lead to even further secularization of the Muslim community. So, I mean, you know, this is something that we need to address now, generations. And again, like, you know, it's something that sometimes we think it's only happening in the West, but it's happening in the East as well. And it's important to take stock of that too.
You mentioned earlier that with regards to like secularizing and racializing definitions of Islamophobia, you mentioned the APPG, and not everyone listening may be familiar with who the APPG are or what significance they have. So would you be able to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the All Parliamentary Party Group is, there's all parliamentary party groups on different issues, universities, on students, on mental health, different issues, right? And it's a group of cross-party, so it's cross-party group, so MPs from different parties come together to work together on specific issues and to host, you know, different groups, stakeholders, activists, academics, community leaders, etc., etc. So there's one for Islamophobia, and there was a report which was commissioned. I think now it was released in 2018, and consultations were taken for that report. However, I don't think everybody who was consulted knew what was going to come out of it. And so this consultation and this report is now what is being used as a basis to form, you know, the definition has been formed. And this definition, to be honest with you, when the report was released and the definition was released, I'll be honest with you, and this is commonly known in the community, it didn't get much traction. and it didn't get much widespread support and consensus from the community. And so for a year, maybe a little bit longer than a year, you know, things kind of went silent. It was being pushed and it wasn't really gaining traction. However, now it's now being pushed again by some academics, a few activists, and a small minority of community leaders. However, I do think, you know, going off of the points we've spoken about before, if we don't have consensus within our community, if critiques on this definition were pushed to those who have been advocating for it, and those critiques have been ignored or suppressed and haven't been properly taken into account, you know, why are we still pushing it? Actually, I think it's irresponsible. And I've said this, I will continue to say it. I know it's not something that's generally liked, but I do think it's irresponsible because this is not just about the now. We need to be thinking of generations of Muslim communities, you know, for years to come. It's not just about the now. If we have a very short-term thinking, which I think that kind of thinking that people have right now is very unstrategic because it's very short-term. In the long term, we can end up disadvantaging our communities because what also happens with this kind of definition is that if you study the report, if you study the definition and you look at how it manifests and how it's used in education spheres and how it's used in society, because the aspect of faith has been sidelined, we have people who merely go by the label or the name of Muslim, but they care not for the values, they care not for the principles, and they care not for the fundamental pillars of our faith, right? But because they have the racial markers, perhaps they've got brown skin, the racial or religious markers, they may you know, have aspects of religiosity that's portrayed, but these are now becoming conflated with racial markers, right? Because they look like your stereotypical Muslim, right? They are now being centered as the spokespeople, and they're now being given platforms as the spokespeople for Muslims. And you know, some of these people are they're not you know, they're not backed by the community. They may not even be known, or they may not even be trusted. But because of this definition, it's not about your beliefs anymore. It's about the way you look and the way you're perceived and the way society perceives you. And we are feeding so much into this thing of how are we looked upon rather than what is actually happening to us, right? And what is the effect? You know, we can look at the flaws I often find in the way academia goes about reviewing what is going on in societies. It often discounts the spiritual, right? And there are spiritual implications mixed in with the structural and the individual and the institutional. And some people will say, look, we live in a secular society. We cannot take into account these things. We need to do it by a framework which matches that of the society we're in so people can understand. And I'll disagree with that, because if it's not going to be an easy journey. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, you know, we do things within our framework and with our narrative, and then we push it out and everybody's going to understand. It's going to take hard work. It's going to take going into all corners of society, lobbying, advocating, speaking boldly, you know, campaigning. But I don't like this defeatist attitude of we can't form a proper narrative on our frameworks and our principles, so we should go with what's already pre-existing, right? I said it's very short-term thinking. We should be able to come up with our own narrative, and I think there's an art of articulating yourself through your own narrative and then portraying that to the rest of society, you know, can understand, even if they're not Muslims. You know, I think we've just kind of given up before we've even started, from my point of view. So that's a bit on the APPG. And as I said, why are we going out to other groups and other places? And as I said, even with the APPG, there are groups and there are people who have insinuated or outwardly professed that Muslims are backward, or they are you know, they're in need, you know, our faith and our religion is in need of reforming. And these are the people that we're consulting on matters that our community doesn't have consensus on. I don't think it's correct. I don't think it makes sense, and I really am baffled as to why we've, why things have been done this way. So
I think just to add to Ayo's point, I think it's really key that we understand that, like, we have to take ownership of this stuff, because I think, in PPT definition, at one point it states perceived Muslimness. And again, as Ayo was saying, it sort of conflates religious markers with racialized markers. And a lot of times the narrative, they use it to prove that, like, people who are Sikh, who have a beard and wear a turban, experience Islamophobia as well. So a definition for Islamophobia needs to experience someone who is Sikh as well, who is getting oppressed and getting persecuted. And I think this is somewhere it baffles me again, as Ayo was saying, like, how can we use someone who adheres to another faith, who does not adhere to the Islamic faith, to incorporate their experience and their lived reality in the framing of our religion and someone who follows Islam? And again, it's interesting that a lot of Sikh groups have come out and had an issue with it as well, that you don't want to give ownership and space to create a discourse around anti-Sikh elements and sentiments, which which is wrong. Again, we agree there shouldn't be any space for that. We're not propagating that they shouldn't be that they should be that. But the problem is, like, you're taking away people's individual identities in that case, which is based on another faith and maybe has a racialized element to it, but you can't apply that to us, to our narrative, and you can't conflate both those oppressions to sort of address them through one framing. It goes back to a colonial understanding as well, in my opinion. All of these people, this binary opposition in understanding identities, that all these people who are not white, they're all probably the same. They're all probably the same. They look similar to us, so their oppression is the same. And it's important to understand the differences between those. And I think it's very key, because when we speak about who gets to define what Islamophobia is, we need to understand that a lot of times people who are Muslim haven't really understood Islam in the way it should be understood to sort of then define Islamophobia. Because I think this goes back to the previous talk that I did last week, that when we talk about Islamophobia, from its core, it's linked to the faith. And when we are creating a definition for Islamophobia, more than an individual and more than the people, it should include our faith and the things of the faith that we hold dear as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our aqidah, the Quran, which is the level of our episteme. Those are the things that give us our identity. Those are the things that give us meaning to the practices that we have. Those are the things that give meaning to the morals and the rationalities and the values that we have. So in its core, we need to situate all that with an understanding of that Islamophobia should also include, things said against the Prophet ﷺ, things said against Islam as a religion, things said against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. How do you define those acts? If you are going for a racialized, identity-based, individual-based interpretation of Islamophobia, where does all of that go? We cannot, as Muslims, allow for those things to go on. We need to be worried about that stuff as well, because the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, this is going back to the seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There was a time when a Sahabi came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ya Rasulullah, and this was in Mecca. Persecution and oppression was at its peak at that time. And the Sahabi radiallahu anhu came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, Ya Rasulullah, make dua for us. We are being oppressed and we are being persecuted right now. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam became angry with that Sahabi. He said, do you think the people who came before you had less persecution and less oppression than you? But the point of what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was saying, that we as Muslims should not be disheartened or discouraged by how society views us, because this oppression, this persecution has always existed on people who are Muslim, on people who follow the message of Islam. But we still know that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they would get angry when the honor of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the honor of the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Islam and what it brought when that honor would be infringed upon, that would hurt them more than them themselves being hurt. So when we situate an understanding and definition of Islamophobia, it has to include these things in Islam which we hold dear, these things which give us our identity, which give us our rationality, which give us our values, which, and again, the practices that we have in Islam as being Muslim as well. It completely detaches of the practices that we have as well. So again, another level of a problematic assumption or presumption that the definition is based upon.
Yeah, you're talking about the definition. When I was speaking, he said he just found it baffling, and that's the word that comes to my mind as well. Like you mentioned, Ijlal, that another Sikhs, for example, a completely different faith group, comes into the Islamophobia definition, which is crazy because then when you conflate race and tradition with religion, they're completely nuanced, right? They're two completely different things.
Even just to go on the Sikh point, I think there have been valid points in that, there's an argument, I'll put it that way, that Sikhs may face Islamophobia because they're targeted, because they look like Muslims, let's put it that way. Again, I think I do lean to what Ijlal is saying. My issue with that is that discourse has often been at the center point on the conversations within Islamophobia, and it may be something which can be talked about on the periphery, as a phenomenon, a sociological phenomenon that happens with Islamophobia, right? People who are perceived or look like Muslims. However, my issue is that that's at the center point of the narrative, right? Even with that, not to deny it happened, but my question is, how often does it happen? Personally, I haven't really seen statistics. I have seen a few stories about it, which are often amplified, but I think Islamophobia, I think we can easily say that Islamophobia that actually happens to actual Muslims vastly outnumbers that which happens to Sikhs. And again, I very much think Sikhs would like to create their own narrative on anti-Sikh sentiments. We shouldn't be meshing and conflating too much, because we need to focus on our own community, right? And this is my issue as well, in that is the definition and is the thoughts and the things that are fed into the definition, is it really reflective of the truth if the community, one, doesn't have a consensus on it, but also hasn't been widely consulted? Because at the moment, from where I'm standing, and with all of these things, I'm happy to have a civilized discussion and conversation. I'm happy to be proved wrong, but this is something I have looked quite extensively into for the last few years, actually. It's not just a few months thing. Since this definition popped up and since the consultation has been happening, it's something I've been keeping an eye on. It seems that sociological phenomena which are happening are being centered rather than what is actually going on the ground in the community. And that's my issue. I don't think it is intellectually honest to center discussions of things which happen in a minority of cases as being the mainstream narrative as to what happens in our community. So these are some of my issues, and I think there is I guess a point, and I hope if there are any academics listening to this, this is not taken as a dig, but I do think there is this question of, especially when I think with this definition, there has been a lot of academic feeding, particularly from Muslims themselves, right? Muslim academics. The question needs to be raised of, when you're working in that kind of epistemological framework and knowledge framework of academia, I myself have done essay-based subjects in my intercalated degree in medicine, and it's very constrained and restrictive in terms of what that framework places on you, in terms of your thought, in terms of your expression, in terms of the conclusions and discussions and the results that you can draw from a certain data set. And my question is, if we have academics purely or primarily leading the drive on this definition, since there will be inevitably a disconnect that often happens, not always, but often happens, between academics and what's going on with the community, are they best placed to be leading this definition and the definitions that our community of Islamophobia that our community is facing. Not to say they shouldn't be part of the discussion at all. However, the monopolization of this discussion by academics, and also I think there is a question of when academics, put forward these kind of definitions or put forward these narratives, who are they accountable to? How are they accountable? I don't see any frameworks or systems of accountability for academics like there are, for example, for community leaders. The academics and a lot of the people who are fed into this definition, who have been leading things, a lot of the community won't even know their name. They won't know who they are, and they won't have any, a clear way of contacting them, or there is no structure of discourse between the wider community and those who are leading this. I don't think that is, I don't think that's the best way to go around things, because if the community does have issues they want to raise, or complaints or points they want to raise, how can they raise it with the people who are leading, this project? There doesn't seem to be a way.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you kind of answered it already, but I was wondering, so with the APPG consultation, there's such a range of individuals who are asked, and I was going to ask what proportion of those asked were Muslim, and how many of the academics were Muslim. And you said, you actually said Muslim academics fed into this secularized, racialized definition.
Yep. I mean, I can't confirm for you the proportion of academics, Muslim academics, and then Muslims, non-Muslims. I can't. It's something I need to go and look at. However, as I said before, there are organizations and people who have been hostile to Muslims openly, behind closed doors, explicitly, implicitly. And these are the people who we've included in this discussion. If those individuals and groups are stakeholders in institutions that we want to push our definition, or our concept of what Islamophobia is from, post community discussions, post community consensus, then I can understand that. But these are people we involved in our we involved them within our consultation. That I struggle to understand. And this is another thing. I can tell a lot of people who have advocated for the report or for the definition haven't actually read the whole thing, because within the report itself, it has narratives which would be described as Islamophobic or anti-Muslim. And we also need to remember that our community is one that we ourselves may not recognize our own power, but there are organizations, think tanks, groups, individuals who recognize the potential power that we can have and the power we do have. And so they have their own agendas that they're trying to insert or impress upon our community. And it's very important that we are we're knowledgeable about that we realize that we have to be careful who we're bringing in. When you read deeper into the report, there are things in there which I'd be surprised if many Muslims were agreeing with, to be honest with you. But some people may just take the definition. The definition comes in the report. If we're looking at institutions, the report would be taken the definition, right? The report is the fundamental basis as to which the definition came about, right? This is what I'm saying. People may use a definition or concept within discussion, but there is a whole backlog of information, of ideas, of concepts which are fed into that definition, what your understanding of that definition is, what your usage of that definition is, but you're not going to see. It's like an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is the visible bit that people use and they see and they become accustomed to, and there's this whole bit underneath which is influencing the way that you are using these things and the way you have come to understand these things. And we really need to open our eyes to what is going on. So it's very important.
Ayo, how do you think we should define the definition, and who do you think should do it?
Okay.
Because I know we have spoken a lot about the issues, right? So give the listeners and the viewers like something tangible to take away. How do you think we should define it?
So I think my thing, even with a definition, right, I think we have become a bit obsessed within the society of defining, right? I think a definition is useful. I think it can be very, very useful. I think examples of what Islamophobia is a good starting point because it gives actual manifestations. The definition, I think, it is important in our society. I think it isn't as essential as people make it out to be. I think examples are often a better way of illustrating what's going on. But I think a definition is important. I do support pushes for, and I do want to see a definition come about in terms of what should it look like. I think it needs to be, it's faith-based, it's a religious type of religious discrimination, right? It's racism does play a part. I don't want to remove that from the equation at all. There are racialized aspects. Racism does play a part. However, I don't believe it to be the central part, right, of the oppression that we face. It's very, very important. I sort of have a way of conceptualizing it, which is sort of looking at it from there's sort of three strands. You know, the things. What are the actual things as Muslims that are targeted about us? Our beliefs, our practice, and outward religious symbols, right? Or outward perceived religious symbols, because not all of these things that are people see as being religious symbols are actually religious symbols. But I see it as those three things. They're not, you know, completely. You can't, you know, they have intersections between them. But you know, belief, for example, targeting our belief, you know, in that believing in Islam and believing in the Quran makes you an extremist or a terrorist or a hateful individual. It makes you somebody who's susceptible to violence, all these kind of things. And then targeting our practice, closing down prayer rooms, stopping us from being able to fast Ramadan, you know, blocking us from giving zakat to certain countries and people that are in need, right? There's different things that this can, you know, in terms of how our practice can be blocked. And then outward religious symbols, you know, the banning of the hijab, the niqab, you know, forcing men to shave their beards. I'm just giving a few examples. There's loads more. You know, this is very, and these are just suggestions. But for me, I want to see belief and practice centered. I want to see religion centered. It's a type of religious discrimination. That religious discrimination, yes, racism is a strand of what we may go through, but it's not the primary thing. It's not the central strand. It's not the center point. And I think when we look at ways of articulating how racism, you know, is manifested structurally within societies, you know, some of these structural analyses on, you know, how racism manifests, I think they can be useful, and some of them can be applied to how Islamophobia manifests, but not all of them. And it shouldn't be, you know, it's exactly the same, because there's the belief and the religion aspect, and there's the, you know, when we look at groups that face racism, you know, ethnic groups, racial groups, there isn't that aspect of belief, because when we're looking at Muslims, what is the primary point of being a Muslim? It's our belief, it's submitting towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That is the reason for our existence. We believe as Muslims. So why is that not the primary thing that comes up when defining oppression? Because look, when people attack mosques, when they rip off the hijab of one of our sisters, when they you know, close down prayer rooms, right? They're doing it because of what Islam represents. They have a hate for our belief. They have a hate for our religion and what we represent, what our community represents, because we aren't bound to nation states. The Ummah is united across borders, right? And again, what our community represents, what our faith represents, the power that we're perceived to have, this is why we're targeted, right? Our practice, belief is targeted. And this can manifest through, yes, pulling off of things like hate crime attacks, you know, vandalism, all these kind of things, right? But I really sincerely doubt that someone looks at a mosque and is like, there's loads of, you know, brown people in there, so I'll attack it. There's a wide aspect of what our beliefs, they see Islam and Muslims as a threat to their way of life, right? Because of how you know, how the media has pushed us to be, we're violent, we're extremist, you know, or XYZ, right? The ideas that are circulating around what Muslims represent. I believe this to be the primary reason we have been demonized and why we're being targeted and why people have prejudice towards us. Not because of primarily because of the way we look. The way we look has roots to what I've just talked about, right? If we're centering the way people look and not what they represent and not what they believe in, you know, then we're going to come to a definition which is intellectually dishonest. It's not going to be reflective of the truth. So this is something I very strongly believe in. Again, for people who may say, oh, I'm just saying racism isn't involved, I'll repeat it again. I believe racism and aspects of racialization are important in the definition, but it should not be the center point. It should not.
I think just to add to Ayo's point, completely agree with everything you were saying, Ayo. I think the way I see it, you know, there's something that we need to add from an Islamic framework as well, because when we do, you know, in Islamic, when we come to ideas of Sharia and fiqh, you know, there is certain things that we have to do. We have to situate everything within how things are referred to in the Quran, and how, you know, things were experienced by the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and our righteous predecessors. So when we look at Islamophobia, why is it that when we talk about Islamophobia, we can't do those same things? We are still talking about something which is, you know, Islam, a form of Islam. Why can't we go into those things? Why can't we look at our history, our Islamic history, how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, how even the prophets before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced these things when we sort of conceptualize Islamophobia? I think this is really important. And you know, those of you who were there for my previous talk, this is what we were saying there. You know, like Islamophobia is something that Ibrahim alayhi salam experienced, something that Musa alayhi salam experienced, Isa alayhi salam experienced, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced, and they all experienced it from people who look like them. You know, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced Islamophobia from his own family members. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum, you know, brothers were killing brothers. So that is where we need to situate our understanding of Islamophobia. Again, it's always, as I was saying, it's always linked to a faith. It's always linked to a belief. And I think this is where, in my opinion, academics, social justice activists, a lot of our community goes wrong, that it's not using that. We have been given a framework in Islam. You know, whenever we have to, if for example, Ishtiaq and I have to have a conversation about, you know, how we should be eating, or what we should be eating, or, you know, how our diet should be structured, one of the first things we're going to do is, what does Islam tell us? What does the Quran tell us? What does Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his example tell us? When we're going to be talking about what sort of clothes to wear, how to dress, you know, to dress modestly and to be careful in the way you dress, to also, you know, a part of even for men and women is hijab, you know, lowering your gaze and experiencing those. These are conversations we're going to have whenever we're going to do something. Why is it that we can't have that same conversation when we start to conceptualize Islamophobia? And that, again, is, in my eyes, like, it's sometimes, you know, like, it's the courage that we as Muslims or activists or academics, we are lacking, that the West and its discourses and the secular West, you know, the secular narratives, they've sort of defeated us to this extent that we don't even have the confidence to talk about Islamophobia from a framework of Islam. That is how scared we are. That is how, you know, under the thumb we are, that we can't even you know, resist that and sort of say, you know what, we're going to talk about Islamophobia through a framework that is based in Islam, through the Quran, through the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because, you know, and everything, that is what we have to return to. So and I think there are some useful framings which Ayo and I have spoken about, you know, before, like Lahabism, Imanophobia, which very much situate these things in a discourse that emerges from Islam, from the Quran, from the example in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
You mentioned, Ijlal, some examples of Islamophobia, how it's not a recent thing, essentially, how there's prophetic examples as well. I was wondering, if you could elaborate. You said there were lots of different examples of Islamophobia in the present day. What examples could you give in particular of it being different to racism? Because you elaborated that there's a nuance between racism and Islamophobia. I was wondering, are there any tangible examples you could give from the present day of this?
Yeah. Okay. So how is one? I'm just trying to think of a way to make this clear with an example.
Because one example, I was thinking, like we touched on it last week in the talk with Ijlal, like if you look at the situation in India, for example, or China, for example, how
Yeah,
it's not based on race.
yeah. I mean, a good one I can give is just the vandalism of mosques, for example. It's a place of worship. Um, and the reason it's targeted is because it's a place of worship and it houses a belief system, which is Islam, right? And it houses, it's the house that, you know, Muslims come to worship. They come to pray, they come to do different acts of worship, right? And this is different to racism because racism is structural, generally. So it's a system of power which privileges one racialized group over another racialized group, right? Uh, um, if we're applying it to right now, where we are right now, it privileges people racialized as white over the rest of you know, other racial groups, essentially. That's one of the definitions of racism. But generally, it's a system or a structure of power, right, which subjugates people who are not within that power system. And that power system is controlled by people racialized as white or white people, right? And this is the thing: Islam. When you go into this paradigm of racism, it now becomes about seeing things through the lens of color, right? And not to say, you know, as we said, you know, within Muslims, there are people of all different colors, groups, nationalities, ethnicities, all these kind of things. However, within the bracket of racism, right, if we start going into that paradigm, it now becomes about white religions and non-white religions, right? This is now the lens we start to see things through. And we have to be careful when using these things, especially on our own faith, because we know our faith isn't owned by any color. It's not owned by any ethnicity, right? It's for the whole of mankind. And when we start grouping our oppression and our faith and our community into this paradigm, these are the conclusions that start to be drawn. This is why I'm very against it, because I have heard these things being said, and I think it's not right. And yeah, I think in terms of, I'm trying to think of examples. I mean, the mosque one is an example. I'll give you another one. Me as a black Muslim, right? People don't look at me and see me as a Muslim. So we also need to think about how those who do not look Muslim also experience what we call Islamophobia. So myself, I was actually by myself, and I was with a group of some non-Muslim black people, and they were saying some quite, you know, discriminatory and derogatory things about Muslims, and very insensitive things, things we would classify as Islamophobia, and they didn't know I was Muslim. And I sort of just kept my mouth shut. I just let them keep talking. Um, I didn't, I wanted to, I was quite bewildered. I was quite baffled. I didn't expect this. So I let them keep speaking. And then, you know, I saw, I think later on they probably saw me and I saw some brothers and I said, Assalamu alaikum. And I think they, oh, wow, they kind of clocked, right? Do you see what I'm saying? And so with racism, there is often this clear thing about who the target is, right? When it comes to racism, when we're looking at color, when we're looking at features, geographies, all these things feed into what the social construct of race constitutes, right? Whereas with Islamophobia, there are many groups who still experience it, but they do not look it, if that makes sense. So that's one of the differences between it. You know, me as a black Muslim, I still face the brunt of prevent and surveillance and all of these things. But if it were to be up to those who characterize Islamophobia as a type of racism, I would slowly become erased out of that, because the things that they center within this discussion is, you know, the way the structures come down on those who are visibly Muslim, right? So again, these social phenomena, right? It's about, you know, wearing the hijab, the beard, the thobe, brown tan skin, South Asian descent, all of these kind of things become the things that are focused upon. But what about white Muslims? What about black Muslims? You know, where do they come in this discussion? What about, you know, Southeast Asian Muslims, say Chinese, Indonesian Muslims? where do they come in these discussions? They're erased. And so this is why we need to widen it to a religious discrimination that is encompassing of all the different racial groups that come under the banner of Islam, the banner of Muslims.
I think another example, is where this definition completely falls flat is when you talk about ex-Muslims and reverts, white reverts to Islam and ex-Muslims who are South Asian. So, there's an example you have with Raheem Kassam, who is he was the editor of Breitbart and an advisor to Nigel Farage, who is an ex-Muslim who thinks Islam is the issue, Muslims are the issue in society, and they need to be stripped of their their commitment to Islam to fix society and to deal with the ills that Islam brings. So here you have, within this definition, a person who fits the definition of perceived Muslimness, who is South Asian, is brown skin, and according to this definition, would be someone who can experience Islamophobia, yet is the person got the Islamophobia. What happens to the definition then? The definition completely falls flat. What do you do with people who might belong to, and Raheem Kassam is a person who believes in far right ideology, in a Western context. Similarly, what to say of a person who was previously someone from a far right party? I think someone called a Dutch politician, Joram van something, can't remember his full name, but a Dutch politician. He was a part of the far right, and he was espousing narratives that were racist, that were against Islam as well. But now he's a Muslim. What do you do? Do you say that because he doesn't fit that definition of being a Muslim himself, those racial markers that you have created in themselves, and he's said things in the past, then do you say a person who is Muslim, who very much practices the Islamic faith, is now an Islamophobe just because the color of their skin doesn't align with your interpretation or your rationalization of what it means to be Muslim or what it means to be someone who follows Islam? So again, the definition, if you put this question to the ones who propagate the usage of this definition, I'd be amazed if they come up with like a logical answer for this.
Yeah, subhanAllah, I feel like that's a very profound point to end on, because there's clear, as you said, there's very clear examples where the definition just completely falls apart, and how even people who went from being Muslim to non-Muslim can still technically, with the definition, be defined as being on the receiving end of Islamophobia. And then I saw the story about the Dutch politician, I think on Facebook or something. It was like he used to do all this like hate preaching, all this campaigning against Islam, against Muslims, and subhanAllah, he got guided to Islam.
Yeah.
Where does he fit into the definition?
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like that's a very profound point to end on.
I think I wanted to come back to what you said in terms of how should this be carried out. It shouldn't just be people who are perceived as being community leaders. It shouldn't just be activists and academics. It should be Muslims who are a bit more detached from the political sphere, also giving their views, having the time. We're a big community, right? I think there's an estimate of like 5 million of us in the UK, something like that. I'm not sure how much of the UK population is Muslim. I think something 3 million, sorry, but I know it's about 5% of the British population is Muslim. A sample size of 100, 200 is not enough. I'm not even sure that number was reached, to be honest with you. Or even 100 or 200 is not enough to draw a definition and conclusions which will impact the whole community. It's something where there needs to be, if we're really serious about this, widespread consultations where we really understand what the community believes to be Islamophobia. And I think within that as well, we need to have our scholars, our shuyukh feeding in. They are the spiritual leaders of our community. How many of them, and I'm not talking about, perhaps scholars the state may favor to produce certain narratives. I'm talking about the ones who are actually connected to the community. How many of them were, have been spoken to about this? How many of them have really been truly involved in this? How many of them are leading this and setting the narrative? it doesn't look to be any, or if there are any, it seems to be very, very few. And even if they are involved, it feels like perhaps their considerations will be discounted. What I'm saying is, look, I think community leaders definitely play a part. Don't get me wrong on this. I think they play a part in shaping the direction. However, I don't think they should be leading without consultation, leading without taking on criticism, leading without, by ignoring criticisms, right? It should be a collation of the different responses and a collation of the feedback. And there needs to be spiritual counsel in this. There needs to be proper community consensus, and then I think we can move forward before going out to other groups and forcing a definition. So my thing would say to anybody who's listening to this, one, I want to say that everything I've said, done my best to research it. If I've said anything wrong, I'm happy to be corrected. I'm happy to be challenged, as long as it's done respectfully. And this does come from absolute love for the Ummah, our community, and also for trying to look out for future generations of Muslims and trying to learn from the past. We don't want to keep reinventing the wheel. We don't want to keep making the same mistakes. We have an ample amount of knowledge to draw from in terms of things that have happened historically. Let us utilize the examples through exerting wisdom, exerting sincerity, and being genuine, and actually trying to find the most the best way forward, which is in line with our values, our principles, and our faith. Inshallah.
Just for myself, I think I really agree with everything that Aya said. The only thing I would add is, I think, when we conceptualize this definition, we need to understand that whatever gets accepted within the community of Britain, within the Ummah of Britain, is something that will have an impact on our Ummah in the rest of the world as well. If we accept it here, and we say we are going to situate the discussion on this definition and the framing of this definition and the usage of this definition only in Britain, we would be doing a massive disservice to the global ummah that we are a part of. We need to understand that if we create a definition that does not hold true in other parts of the world, or for a wider experience of what it means to be Muslim in other parts of the world, we would be doing a disservice to the ummah of Islam. And there will be points where people conceptualizing Islamophobia in other parts of the world will look to a definition that has been widely accepted and propagated within the Ummah of Britain to then sort of understand and use for their oppression as well. So we won't only be doing a disservice to the Ummah of Britain, but we will be doing a disservice to the wider Ummah as well, because it does happen. When you look, other oppressions have been defined. For example, other international organizations or organizations in other parts of the world would look at how those things have been defined already in certain parts of the world to then sort of use that same framing. So we need to be very careful that we are not creating something which we think is very specific around certain experiences, but does not situate this in the wider experience. And this is why it goes into these ideas of, this South Asian cultural hegemony that it uses to conceptualize Islamophobia as well. It doesn't understand the racialized aspect of, it focuses more on the racialized aspect of things, because it uses just certain experiences to conceptualize Islamophobia. So if we are going to conceptualize Islamophobia, my message that the people who are listening and watching this should take away is that, firstly, we need to situate it within a global discourse. We need to situate it within a historical discourse, and most importantly, we need to situate it within something that is rooted within Islam, within submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran, the Sunnah of Rasulullah and our righteous predecessors. We need to situate it within Islam to then understand Islamophobia, not what some other Muslims are saying.
Definitely, inshallah khair. Before we wrap up, I was wondering, Aya, for anyone who's listening or watching, where can they find the work you're doing or the work Fos is doing? If they're interested to find out more, where can they head?
Inshallah. So if you just type in FOSIS on Facebook, you'll find them. On Instagram and Twitter, it's Fosis Channel. So literally just Fosis with the word channel, and you'll find it. In terms of my Twitter, which is where I do a lot of my commentary, It's AYOOLATUNJI8. That's my @ and you can find things I kind of post on there. I've got Instagram as well. I post reminders and I post things on this. I try and speak openly on these things. So I think I'm speaking more and more openly on it because I think it's important we have these discussions and people hear these opinions and it's not just kept to backdoor discussions. So my Instagram as well is A_Y_DOT_, and you'll find me there. So it's up to you if you want to follow. Of course, there's no issue. I think please definitely follow the work of Fosis. In terms of myself, it's completely up to you. But these are I post some of my own more personal commentaries on these things. So yeah, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair for taking the time today, Ayo, to deliver that talk, and Jazakallah khairan to everyone, you as well, Ijlal, for taking your time to speak to us today, and to all of our viewers and listeners. And we'll be doing more similar, inshallah. So yeah, for more talks like this, just follow Sussex ISOC on Instagram, such as sussex.isoc, and we've got a Facebook page and a Facebook group as well. I think it's just Sussex ISOC as well. So yeah, all updates you can find them there. So Jazakumullah khairan, Ayo and Ijlal, for your input today, and I think we'll wrap up there. So Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.